Welcome back to the deep dive. I hope you are ready to think, because today we are tackling a figure who is nothing short of a titan. And I don't use that word lightly.
Not at all.
We are talking about a woman whose name is practically synonymous with French intellectualism, with the hazy smoke of the Café de Flore, with existentialism, and certainly absolutely with modern feminism.
Mm-hmm.
We are unpacking the life, the work, and the incredibly complicated legacy of Simone de Beauvoir.
Titan is exactly the right word. In fact, you could argue it's an understatement. This is someone who didn't just participate in the culture of her time.
No.
She fundamentally reshaped the way we think about gender, about freedom, about ethics. She literally gave us the vocabulary to talk about what it means to be a woman and really what it means to be a human being. But, and this is the key thing, she's also a figure who completely defies easy categorization. She's an icon, for sure. But when you really peel back the layers and you look at the sources we have today, the biographies, her own memoirs, the philosophical texts, and especially the letters, you see a much more complex and at times a deeply controversial person.
Exactly. I think a lot of people know the name. They might know she wrote The Second Sex.
Maybe.
They almost certainly know she was the partner of Jean-Paul Sartre. But the image we have of her, it's often just a silhouette. You know?
Yeah, it's a caricature almost.
It is. We see the philosopher in the cafe, wearing the turban, smoking a cigarette, writing furiously in a notebook. It's all very chic, very Parisian.
Right.
But the reality, it is so much messier, more fascinating, and frankly, more challenging than that postcard version.
It is.
Yeah.
And that's really our mission for this deep dive. We want to look past the icon. We want to understand how a dutiful daughter from a strict, bourgeois Catholic family transformed herself into a radical atheist and a groundbreaking social theorist.
And we have to unpack that famous soul partnership with Sartre.
We do. Because it was revolutionary for its time, sure, but it also had some very, very dark corners that we need to shine a light on. The sources are pretty clear about that now.
And we absolutely have to get into the heavy stuff. We're going to decode the central thesis of The Second Sex, that famous line, one is not born, but becomes a woman.
The line that changed everything.
It did. And we need to figure out why the English-speaking world basically misunderstood that book for decades. But then we're also going to confront the uncomfortable truths. The sources we have today, they don't shy away from the allegations regarding her relationships with her students or her signing certain political petitions that look, well, they look very different through a modern lens.
You have to look at the whole picture, the brilliance and the shadows. You really can't separate the philosophy from the life with Beauvoir, because her entire project was about living her philosophy, for better or for worse.
So let's start at the beginning. Because to understand the radical, you really have to understand the cage she broke out of. And honestly, her beginnings sound like something out of a 19th century novel, born in 1908, Paris.
Right, in the 6th arrondissement.
Right. Wealthy banker's daughter, lawyer father. It sounds picture perfect.
It was a very bourgeois upbringing and very, very rigid. Her father, Georges Bertrand de Beauvoir, was a lawyer. He was a man of culture, loved literature, the theater. He had actually aspired to be an actor at one point.
Oh, interesting.
And her mother, Françoise, was a wealthy banker's daughter and a deeply, deeply devout Catholic. So you have this tension right from the start inside the house.
Between what? Art and religion?
Exactly. You've got the worldly, artistic, somewhat agnostic aspirations of the father clashing with the strict, pious, almost severe morality of the mother. Simone was caught right in the middle of that.
And she was precocious. I mean, intellectually, she was on fire from a very young age. She was just devouring books.
Completely. She taught herself to read before she was even supposed to.
And there is this quote from her father that I found in the notes. I guess it's supposed to be a compliment, but it lands differently today. He used to boast to his friends, Simone has a man's brain. She thinks like a man. She is a man.
Oof. That really sets the stage, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It highlights exactly what she would later dedicate her life to fighting against.
Yeah.
This idea that intellect, logic, reason, and capability are inherently male traits.
Yeah.
But for her father in that era, that was the absolute highest praise he could give his daughter.
So he was proud of her, but in a really constrained way.
He was seeing her potential, absolutely, but he could only articulate it by erasing her gender. He encouraged her studies, which was unusual for the time, but he was also reinforcing the very binary that she would eventually spend her life trying to dismantle.
But then the script of her life, the one that seemed pre-written for her, just got completely flipped. It wasn't just ideas that changed her path. The material reality of her life it collapsed.
The money ran out. It's as simple as that. After World War I, the family lost most of their fortune. Her maternal grandfather's bank, the Bank of the Mews, it collapsed.
So they went from wealthy to what?
To struggling. They had to maintain the appearance being bourgeois, but the reality was very different. They had to move from a grand apartment on the Boulevard Raspail to a smaller, darker one on the Rue de Rennes. No running water. They had to walk up 6 flights of stairs. It was a deep humiliation for the family.
And this is crucial, right? Because of this financial collapse, her dowry was gone.
Gone. And we have to pause on the dowry thing because for you listening now, that sounds so archaic. But in the context of 1920s French upper-middle-class society, marriage was a transaction. It was a business deal between families.
No dowry, no marriage. Is that basically it?
For her class, precisely. Without a dowry, you couldn't buy a husband of suitable status. Her marriage prospects they evaporated overnight. But here is the aha moment, the turning point. Beauvoir didn't see this as a tragedy. She saw it as a liberation.
It's the classic blessing in disguise, but on a massive, life-altering scale.
It completely forced her hand. Because she couldn't rely on a husband to support her, she had to work. She had to earn her own living. That necessity drove her toward education and eventually economic independence, which of course became a cornerstone of her feminist philosophy later on.
So she knew from a young age that her brain was her only asset.
It was her only way out. She realized that if she'd had that dowry, she likely would have been married off to some respectable lawyer or a banker, had 5 kids, and we never would have heard of Simone de Beauvoir.
So if the bank hadn't collapsed, we might never have had the second sex. We might have just had Simone, the Parisian housewife.
It is very, very likely. The loss of her family's privilege was the catalyst for her personal and intellectual freedom. It's profound irony.
And there was another major break from her background happening at the same time. Her faith. Remember, she was raised in this incredibly strict Catholic environment.
Convent schools, the whole 9 yards. She was incredibly religious as a child. She wrote in her memoirs that she wanted to become a nun. She would play at being a martyr.
So what happened? How do you go from wanting to be a nun to being one of the world's most famous atheists?
It was a hard pivot. It happened during a crisis of faith when she was about 14.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just a sort of drifting away like, oh, I'm too busy for church now. It was a conscious, deliberate, intellectual decision.
She thought it through.
Deeply. She decided that she wanted to confront the world honestly, on its own terms, without what she saw as the comfort of illusion. She felt that using faith to explain the world's suffering or its mysteries was, in her words, an evasion.
There's a quote here from her writings that is it's scathing, she said. The believer derives a sense of great superiority from this very cowardice itself.
Ouch. That is sharp.
Right. She's basically saying, you think you're better than me because you have faith, but really you're just afraid. I'm the brave one for facing the void without a safety net.
And that atheism stayed with her for the rest of her life. Yeah. It's absolutely central to existentialism. The core idea is that if there is no God, there's no predetermined purpose for humanity. There's no divine blueprint for your life. You are thrown into the world, and you alone are responsible for creating your own meaning.
That's terrifying for a lot of people.
It's terrifying, but it's also radically freeing. She started that journey at 14, deciding to face the universe without a buffer.
So she's broken with the church. She's broken with the traditional path of marriage. Now she throws herself completely into academia. And domination really is the right word here. She goes to the Sorbonne. She sits in on classes at the École Normale Supérieure.
Which is like the Ivy League of French philosophy, but even more exclusive.
Yeah.
It was the absolute training ground for the intellectual elite.
And she prepares for the agrégation.
We really need to explain the agrégation because it doesn't have a perfect equivalent in the US or UK systems. It isn't just a final exam or a PhD defense. It's a grueling, year-long, highly competitive national ranking exam.
So it's not just pass-fail, it's about where you rank in the entire country.
Exactly. Your rank determines your entire career. It determines whether you get to teach at a prestigious university in Paris or get sent off to a high school in the provinces. It separates the wheat from the chaff in the French education system.
And she didn't just pass, she crushed it.
She did. In 1929, she was 21 years old. She was the youngest person to ever pass the philosophy agrégation at that time.
The youngest ever. That is just incredible.
And looking at the final rankings, she came in second. But we have to qualify that because we have to ask, who came in first?
Jean-Paul Sartre.
Right. But Sartre was 24. And crucially, he was retaking the exam. He had failed it the previous year because he was too arrogant in his answers. He tried to be too original, and the judges, who value tradition, failed him for it.
So he had an extra year of prep.
And he was older, and he was male, and the jury, well, the records show they debated heavily. They narrowly awarded Sartre first place because he was the boy genius, the established figure from the ENS. But many on the jury felt that Beauvoir was actually the sharper, more precise, more philosophically rigorous candidate that year.
Still, second place to Sartre at 21 as the youngest ever to pass. That solidified it. She was economically independent, she was a certified genius, and she had met the man who would be her partner for the next 51 years.
Which brings us to the pact.
The pact. This is the stuff of legend. This is what every philosophy undergrad talks about. So they meet during college while they're studying for the agrégation. She wasn't interested at first, right?
Not really, no. Sartre was short. He had a wandering eye, literally. He had strabismus. And he wasn't traditionally handsome. He was, by all accounts, quite messy. But he was relentless. He was completely captivated by her determination and her intellect.
He saw her as an equal.
He was the first person she'd ever met who she felt was her intellectual equal. That's what won her over. The conversation was just on another level. But when things got serious and her father confronted them, the expectation was, naturally, marriage.
But Beauvoir had no dowry, and as we've established, she had no interest in the institution itself.
She really, really hated the idea of marriage. She viewed it as a trap. She called it an alienating institution. She thought it was dangerous for men because they get saddled with the burden of providing, and it was enslaving for women because they become economically and emotionally dependent.
There's a quote of hers. Any institution which solders one person to another, obliging people to sleep together who no longer want to, is a bad one.
Right. So for her, marriage was a kind of institutionalized bad faith. It forced you to pretend feelings you might not have anymore.
So instead of a wedding ring, Sartre proposes a lease.
A 2-year lease. It's a very cinematic scene. They were sitting on a bench outside the Louvre, and he said, let's sign a 2-year lease. A renewable one, but a lease nonetheless.
It sounds so transactional. I'll take the apartment and the relationship for 24 months, please, with an option to renew.
It was their attempt to structure freedom into commitment. And they came up with this famous distinction. They had their essential love, which was what they had between them.
Yeah.
And then there were contingent loves.
Meaning they could see other people.
Exactly. The essential love was the core, the primary, unshakable intellectual and emotional bond. But contingent loves affairs, flings, even serious relationships with other people were permitted.
What was the main rule?
Total transparency. They promised to tell each other everything. No secrets, no lies. Every detail of their contingent loves had to be shared.
And they actually stuck to this.
For 51 years, they never lived together. They never married. They never had children. It was a sexual relationship, especially at the beginning, but it wasn't an exclusive one. And more than anything, it was a profound intellectual symbiosis.
They read everything the other wrote, didn't they, before anyone else?
Always. They were each other's first and most important reader and critic. There's still a huge debate among scholars about who influenced whom more. For a long time, the story was that she was his disciple.
The junior partner.
Right. Even she downplayed her own philosophical originality sometimes to her detriment. But modern scholarship, especially looking at her diaries and early essays, shows she was reading philosophers like Hegel and Leibniz independently. She influenced his seminal work Being and Nothingness just as much, if not more in some areas, as he influenced her.
And he gave her that nickname, Castor.
Yes, Castor, which is French for beaver. It was given to her by their friend René Maheu. It was partly a play on her name. Beauvoir sounds a bit like beaver in English, but also because, as Maheu said, beavers are animals that live in communities and have a constructive bent.
She was a worker.
She was an incredibly hard worker, always building. Yeah, building arguments, building books, building a life.
So they have this open relationship. They're the undisputed power couple of the Parisian intellectual scene. But this wasn't just about living a bohemian lifestyle. They were turning their lives into philosophy. And Beauvoir started doing this through fiction.
Fiction was a major vehicle for her philosophical ideas. She believed that philosophy wasn't just abstract logic you write in an essay. It had to be lived. It had to be experienced in the complexities of human relationships.
And her first novel is a perfect example of this. She Came to Stay, published in 1943.
Right. On the surface, it's a novel about a tense love triangle in Paris. But really, it's a thinly veiled, fictionalized account of a real-life ménage à trois involving Beauvoir, Sartre, and two sisters, Olga and Wanda Kosakiewicz.
Wait, actual sisters?
Yes. Olga was one of Beauvoir's students. Beauvoir became, you could say, infatuated with her, perhaps obsessed is the better word. Sartre then tried to pursue Olga. Olga rejected him, so he moved on to her sister Wanda. It was incredibly messy and emotionally fraught.
Vessi is an understatement. That sounds like a modern-day reality TV show, not high philosophy.
But in the book, Beauvoir uses this very real, very painful drama to explore a deep philosophical concept, the relationship between the self and the other. It's about consciousness.
How so?
The book's core idea is that the existence of another person, another consciousness, is a threat to your own. When someone else enters the room, they steal the world from you because they see it from their own perspective, turning you into an object in their world. The novel ends in a rather violent way to resolve this philosophical problem.
So she's taking her real-life jealousy and emotional turmoil and turning it into a high-stakes analysis of human consciousness.
Exactly, and she did it again and again. Her most famous novel is probably The Mandarins from 1954. That book actually won the Prix Goncourt, which is France's highest literary prize, like the Booker or the Pulitzer.
And that's another one based on her life, right?
Yes, it's a roman à clef novel with a key. It's about her intellectual circle after World War II, grappling with their political commitments in the new Cold War era. All the characters are based on real people, Sartre, Camus, herself.
And that one was dedicated to Nelson Algren, right? The American writer. We'll definitely get to him later. But it just shows again that for her, life, love, politics, and philosophy were all completely intertwined.
You can't separate them. And this feeds directly into her more explicit work on existentialist ethics. She wrote these important but lesser-known essays like Pyrrhus and Cineas and The Ethics of Ambiguity. And in them, she argued that existentialism is the only philosophy that really takes evil seriously.
How so? Because usually people think existentialism means nothing matters, so do whatever you want.
That's the common nihilist misinterpretation. But Beauvoir fought fiercely against that. She takes on Dostoevsky's famous lines from the brothers Karamazov. If God does not exist, everything is permitted. But she flips it. She says, because there is no God, we are solely responsible for everything.
The buck stops with us.
Entirely. We don't have a divine rule book or a cosmic plan to hide behind. So freedom isn't just doing whatever you feel like. That's childish. Authentic freedom requires recognizing and willing the freedom of others.
That is a crucial distinction. There's a quote here. No project can be defined except by its interference with other projects.
Right. It means your freedom is bound up with everyone else's.
Yeah.
You cannot be truly free if you are oppressing others. If you're a tyrant, you aren't free. You are dependent on your slaves for your identity. It's a deeply moral and responsible philosophy, contrary to what a lot of its critics claimed.
And they try to put this into practice with their political journal, Le Temps Moderne, The Modern Times.
Yes, co-founded in 1945 with Sartre and the philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty. The guiding philosophy was engagement. Writers and intellectuals must be engaged. They must take sides on the political issues of the day.
You can't just be an ivory tower academic.
Exactly. You can't sit on the sidelines of history. Sartre, in the journal's famous preface, blamed the writer Flaubert for the bloody repression of the Paris Commune in 1871. Not because Flaubert was a soldier or a politician, but because, as Sartre put it, he did not write a line to stop it.
Wow. That is a ridiculously high bar for a writer. If you don't actively write against injustice, you are complicit in it.
That was their creed. Silence is not neutral. Silence is an act of support for the oppressor. It's a very demanding ethical position.
Okay, so she's established herself as a major philosopher, a Prix Goncourt winning novelist, a public intellectual. She is a giant in the French scene. But then comes 1949, the book that changed everything, The Second Sex.
Le Deuxième Sexe. This is the big one. It is, without exaggeration, the foundation of second-wave feminism.
And it gave us that dictum, probably one of the most famous sentences of the 20th century. One is not born, but rather becomes a woman.
It's a line that has echoed through the decades, and we need to really, really unpack it because it's so often misunderstood or just quoted out of context.
So what was she actually saying there? What does it mean to become a woman?
She was making a radical distinction for the time between biological sex, being born with female anatomy, and the social construct of gender, the process of becoming a woman as society defines it.
So female is biology, but woman is an idea.
It's an idea that is imposed upon you. She's saying that womanhood, with all its associated traits, passivity, domesticity, being emotional, being focused on beauty and pleasing others, isn't a natural state. It's not your destiny. It's a process. It is something society forces upon you from the moment you are born, from the moment you're wrapped in a pink blanket and told to be a good little girl.
It's the difference between biology and a script you're forced to perform.
That's a great way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
And to explain how this happens, she reintroduces her concept of the other. She argues that throughout history, man has defined himself as the subject, the absolute, the default human being. And woman is always defined relative to him. She is the other.
She's not her own person. She's defined by her relationship to the man.
Precisely. And she dives deep into history for this, doesn't she? She goes through mythology, biology, psychoanalysis, and historical materialism to prove her point.
She cites Aristotle.
Right. She quotes Aristotle, who said, "Women are female by virtue of a certain lack of qualities." She quotes St. Thomas Aquinas, who called women imperfect men or incidental beings. She shows how this isn't just a few misogynists, it's baked into the very foundation of Western thought.
And she says men create a mystery around women. What does she mean by that?
It's a tactic. She says that when men don't understand women or don't want to make the effort to, they label them mysterious. If women are these strange, unknowable, mystical creatures, then men are excused from treating them as equals or trying to understand their actual problems. It's a convenient myth to maintain power.
And this all leads to her famous ideas of immanence versus transcendence. I love these terms because they sound very philosophical and fancy, but they're actually very practical.
They really are. Transcendence is the goal of human existence for any existentialist. It's reaching out into the world, taking action, creating, having projects, shaping your future. It's building a bridge, writing a book, inventing a vaccine, starting a company. It's about transcending your current situation.
And immanence is the opposite.
Immanence is stagnation. It's passive existence. It's being acted upon rather than acting. It's the realm of maintenance, of repetition.
And she argued that women are systematically forced into a life of immanence.
Yes. She talks about housework in a very specific philosophical way. Cooking, cleaning, washing dishes. These are endless cycles of repetition. You wash the dishes just so they can get dirty again tomorrow. You aren't creating anything new that lasts. You are just maintaining the status quo.
She argued that women are resigned to this world of immanence, and the only way out is through transcendence, which for her requires economic independence above all else.
You can't have projects if you can't pay your own rent.
Basically, yes.
Now, here's the absolute tragedy of this book. It comes out in France in 1949. It causes a massive scandal. The Vatican puts it on the index of prohibited books. Albert Camus is furious about how she portrays men. But when it gets translated into English, something goes terribly wrong. Something goes wrong is putting it very, very mildly. The American publisher, Alfred A. Knopf, hired a man named Howard Parsley to translate it in 1953. Parsley was a professor of zoology at Smith College.
Wait, let me get this straight. A zoology professor to translate one of the most important and dense philosophical texts of the century.
Yes, his academic expertise was in reproduction and insects, not existentialism or Hegelian philosophy. And the publisher's wife, Blanche Knopf, who prompted the translation, urged him to simplify it, to cut things down, to make it more palatable for an American audience.
So what did he do? How bad was it?
It was a disaster. First, he cut huge sections. About 15% of the book just vanished. He cut out dozens of historical figures she mentioned. He cut out entire arguments about the history of women's rights. But far worse than the cuts, he mistranslated key philosophical concepts.
Can you give an example?
Sure. When Beauvoir used a specific Hegelian or Heideggerian term for, say, consciousness or being for itself, he would just translate it with a generic English word that lost all the philosophical weight. He made it seem less like a rigorous philosophical argument and more like a dry, if radical, sociological study about the sexes.
So for decades, English speakers, including all major feminists in America and the UK in the 60s and 70s, were reading a butchered, dumbed-down version of the second sex.
Yes. It fundamentally distorted her message. It made her seem less original, less philosophically rigorous than she actually was. A faithful, integral translation wasn't published until 2009, 60 years later.
That is just mind-blowing. We spent half a century misunderstanding one of the most important books of the 20th century because of a bad translation by a bug expert.
It really is a tragedy of intellectual history.
Yeah.
It seriously delayed the full appreciation of her genius in the English-speaking world.
Okay, so we have the philosopher, but let's look at the woman herself. We talked about the essential love with Sartre, but there are many contingent loves. And one of them seems to have been pretty essential too, Nelson Algren.
This is such a fascinating and humanizing chapter of her life. It shows a completely different side of her. She met Nelson Algren in Chicago in 1947. She was doing a 4-month lecture tour of the U.S., which she wrote about in her book, America Day by Day.
And who was he? He wasn't part of her Paris circle.
Not at all. He was the absolute opposite of the Parisian intellectual she knew. Algren was a gritty, tough American writer. He wrote The Man with the Golden Arm. He knew the streets, the junkies, the underbelly of Chicago. He was raw and masculine in a way Sartre wasn't.
And they fell hard for each other.
They did. It was an incredibly passionate, physical, and deeply emotional love affair. In her letters to him, which are just heartbreaking to read, she called him her beloved husband. Think about that. This is the woman who rejected marriage as an institution, calling this man her husband.
That says so much. But the relationship, it didn't last. It couldn't.
It couldn't. This was the pact in action, and this is where you see its brutal side. She would not leave Paris. She would not leave Sartre and her intellectual life there. That was the essential. Algren wanted her to move to Chicago and build a life with him. She refused. Ultimately, she chose her work and her partnership with Sartre over her romantic love for Algren.
And Algren was bitter about it for the rest of his life.
Extremely. He felt used and betrayed, especially because she took their intimate relationship and put it directly into her novel, The Mandarins. He felt his privacy, their love, had been mined for literary material. He famously said, "Hell, love shouldn't be that one-sided. A woman who sleeps with you all night and then gets up and writes about it in a book."
But she never forgot him.
Never. Decades later, when she died in 1986, she was buried wearing a silver ring that Nelson Algren had given her.
Wow. That just adds such a layer of sadness to the whole story. She made her existential choice to stick with Sartre and her freedom in Paris, but she carried that other love, that other possible life, to her grave.
And there were others, too. It wasn't just Algren. She lived with Claude Lanzmann, the filmmaker who later made the monumental documentary Shoah from 1952 to 1959. She had a long-term relationship with a writer named Jacques-Laurent Bost. She was a woman who lived fully in her body as well as her mind. She was not some cold, detached ascetic.
And here's where the deep dive gets really difficult. Her romantic and sexual life wasn't just about consenting adults like Algren or Lanzmann. There are serious allegations that tarnish this image of the liberated woman. We have to talk about her time as a teacher.
We do. And this is the part of her biography that often gets left out of the celebratory articles, but the sources are clear and we have to confront them. In 1943, during the Nazi occupation of Paris, Beauvoir was suspended from her teaching position. She was accused of seducing a 17-year-old student named Natalie Sorokin.
And this wasn't just a school board rumor. There were legal charges.
Sorokin's parents pressed charges for debauching a minor. Now, the age of consent in France at the time was 13, but there were specific laws against the corruption of minors by people in positions of authority, like a teacher. As a result, Beauvoir's national teaching license was permanently revoked. It was later reinstated after the war, but the incident is on the record.
And it gets worse and more detailed with the revelations from another former student, Bianca Lamblin.
Yes. This is perhaps the most damning account we have. Bianca Lamblin, who was born Bianca Bienenfeld, wrote a book in the 1990s titled Memoirs of a Deranged Young Girl. She was a brilliant student of Beauvoir's during the war, and she alleges that Beauvoir groomed her starting when she was 16.
Groomed her for what, exactly?
For a sexual relationship that would involve both Beauvoir and Sartre. Bianca describes what she calls a trio dynamic. She says Beauvoir first seduced her, gained her absolute trust and love, and then introduced her to Sartre to become his lover as well.
So it wasn't a relationship between three equals.
Not according to Lamblin. She describes feeling like a sexual toy for the famous couple. She felt that they used her and other young women to spice up their own relationship, to test their philosophical ideas, and then discarded her when they got bored.
That is just devastating. A sexual toy. It sounds like they were treating people not as subjects with their own freedom, but as objects for their own projects.
And it gets even more chilling. Decades later, after Sartre died, his and Beauvoir's letters to each other were published. Bianca Lamblin read them and found that they referred to her by a cruel pseudonym, Louise Vidrine. She read what they wrote to each other about her while the affair was happening, analyzing her, mocking her insecurities, discussing her sexual performance. She said she felt nauseated. She realized the woman she had loved and admired, her teacher, had been systematically deceiving her.
It really complicates the whole idea of the pact and its transparency, doesn't it? Their freedom, their honesty with each other. It seems it came at the direct expense of these vulnerable young women.
It forces us to ask a very uncomfortable question. Was their brand of existentialist freedom predatory? Beauvoir argued in her philosophy that your freedom requires the freedom of others. But in these cases, it seems their project interfered destructively with the projects of these young women. They treated them as objects, not as free subjects. It's a profound contradiction.
And looking at her political activism later in life, there's another controversy that jumps out, and it's a really shocking one. The 1977 petition.
This is a very difficult context to understand today, but it's crucial. In 1977, the intellectual climate in post-1968 France was extremely libertarian, especially around issues of sexuality. And Beauvoir, along with Sartre, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and many other leading intellectuals, signed a public petition.
What was the petition for?
It was supporting the release of 3 men who had been arrested for having sex with minors, some as young as 12 and 13.
12 and 13. That is just shocking to hear.
It is. It was known as the Affaire de Versailles. The petition argued against the age of consent laws. The argument, which seems completely alien to us now, was framed as a matter of sexual liberation. It argued that children had a right to their own desire and consent, and that the state shouldn't police sexuality.
It's hard to even process that logic.
Looking back, it is profoundly disturbing to see these intellectual giants defending what we would unequivocally call pedophilia today. It's a stark reminder that even the most progressive icons can have moral blind spots that are horrifying in retrospect.
Absolutely. You can't just gloss over that. It shows how the dogma of liberation, if it's not grounded in an ethics of care and the protection of the vulnerable, can be taken to a very dangerous extreme.
Right.
Let's pivot to her later years, where her activism took a more recognizable feminist shape. Because, interestingly, she didn't always call herself a feminist, did she?
No, not at all. Initially, she was a socialist, first and foremost. Like many intellectuals of her generation, she believed that the class struggle was the primary struggle. The theory was that if you solved capitalism and had a socialist revolution, the woman question would just sort of resolve itself automatically.
But she changed her mind on that.
She did. By the 1970s, she looked around and realized that wasn't happening. She saw that sexism was just as rampant in leftist circles. The male socialists were just as patriarchal as the capitalists. So in 1972, she publicly and formally declared herself a feminist. She joined the women's liberation movement.
And she put her name and her body on the line with the manifesto of the 343.
This was a huge deal. It was in 1971. Abortion was completely illegal in France and very dangerous. So 343 prominent women signed a public manifesto, which Beauvoir wrote, admitting that they had had illegal abortions.
So they were admitting to a crime.
A serious crime. They were risking prosecution. Beauvoir signed it. Her sister Helene signed it. Famous actresses like Catherine Deneuve signed it. It was a massive act of civil disobedience designed to show how widespread the practice was and to demand reproductive rights. It was nicknamed the Manifesto of the 343 Sluts.
And it worked eventually.
It was a major catalyst. It paved the way for the Veil Law in 1975, which legalized abortion in France. It was a huge concrete political victory.
But even in her feminist phase, she still had some pretty controversial, or at least very rigid, views on women's roles. I was reading about an interview she did with Betty Friedan, the American feminist, and she was totally against the idea of paying women for housework.
She was, vehemently. Friedan and others in the wages for housework movement suggested that maybe women should be compensated for the labor they do in the home. Beauvoir was completely opposed. She believed that if you paid women for housework, it would just institutionalize their oppression. It would trap them in the home forever.
It would make being a housewife a formal profession.
Exactly. And she took it a step further. She said, and this is a direct quote from that interview, "No woman should be authorized to stay at home to raise her children."
Authorized? That sounds incredibly authoritarian.
It does to our ears. Her reasoning was that as long as the choice to stay home exists, social and family pressure will always push women into taking it. She wanted to essentially force women into the public sphere, into the workforce, because she saw that as the only possible path to transcendence and equality.
So it's a very rigid, almost unforgiving form of liberation. You must be free in this specific way, even if you don't want to be.
That's a very Beauvoir way of putting it. She demanded a lot from women because she believed they were capable of a lot, and she saw domesticity as an existential trap.
As she got older, she also made some interesting and unconventional moves regarding her own family, or lack thereof. She adopted a daughter late in life.
Yes, Sylvie Le Bon. But this wasn't a traditional adoption of a child. Sylvie was a philosophy student and a close friend of hers for years, and she was in her late 30s when Beauvoir legally adopted her in 1980.
So why adopt a grown woman?
There were two main reasons. Part of it was practical. She needed a literary executor. She wanted someone she trusted absolutely to manage her literary estate, to handle her copyrights and legacy, especially after seeing the conflicts that arose over Sartre's estate after he died.
And the other reason?
The other reason was philosophical. Scholars see it as another act of resistance against the traditional family. She was resisting the bioheteronormative family unit. Just as she had created her own relationship structure with Sartre, she was creating her own family structure. She chose her daughter. It was an act of will.
Speaking of Sartre, his decline in his final years was brutal, and she wrote about it very unflinchingly.
An adieu. A farewell to Sartre, published in 1981, a year after his death.
Yeah.
It's a painful, raw, almost clinical account of his last decade. He went blind, he lost control of his bodily functions, his mind started to slip, and she chronicled it all.
And that caused controversy too, right?
A huge controversy. Many in their circle felt it was a betrayal, that she was exposing him at his most vulnerable. But for her, it was the ultimate act of transparency, the final fulfillment of their pact to tell each other and the world everything. But again, conflict followed. She edited Sartre's letters after his death, omitting things, using pseudonyms to protect people, which led to accusations of censorship.
It seems like conflict just followed her everywhere she went.
It did. But she kept working until the very end. She wrote a powerful book about aging called The Coming of Age, which is a brutal look at how society discards the elderly, and a heartbreaking book about her mother's death from cancer called A Very Easy Death. She never stopped analyzing the human condition.
And she died in 1986.
Of pneumonia at the age of 78. She is buried next to Sartre at Montparnasse Cemetery in Paris in a single grave.
So we've covered the bourgeois rebel, the existential lover, the feminist pioneer, and the alleged predator. It is a lot to hold in one's head about one person.
It is. And I think that complicated legacy is best summed up by a famous anecdote, something that happened when she was speaking at Harvard.
Oh, I know this one. It's so telling.
A male scholar who was on stage with her became exasperated and chastised the audience. He said, "Every question you've asked about Sartre concerned his work, his philosophy. But all the questions you've asked about Beauvoir have concerned her personal life."
That is the tragedy right there, isn't it? Even at Harvard, even at the height of her fame, she was still the woman, the personality, the partner, while he was the philosopher.
But look at where we are now. Her influence is undeniable and, in many ways, has outlasted Sartre's in popular culture. Kate Millett, Germaine Greer, Betty Friedan, the titans of second-wave feminism all cited the second sex as their starting point. And today, a thinker like Judith Butler takes Beauvoir's idea of becoming a woman and expands it into the modern theory of gender performativity.
So you can't tell the story of the 20th century without her. Her work is the bedrock for so much of what came after.
It is. And in 2019, Time magazine, as part of a project to correct its history, retroactively awarded her Woman of the Year for 1949, the year The Second Sex was published.
A little late to the party, but deserved.
Better late than never.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left thinking about that quote on faith we talked about at the beginning. She said, "Faith allows an evasion of those difficulties which the atheist confronts honestly." She wanted to confront the void, to live without excuses.
Which I think raises a really provocative final thought for you, our listener, to take away. Beauvoir wanted to live without bad faith. She wanted to be totally responsible for her actions in a godless universe. So when we look at her whole life, the incredible triumphs of freedom she achieved for herself and for millions of women, but also the real damage she caused to people like Bianca Lamblin in her pursuit of that freedom, does her life serve as the ultimate test of her own existentialist ethics?
Did she pass her own test?
That is for you to decide. But one thing is for sure. She certainly didn't evade the difficulty of living.
Thank you for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.
Welcome to the debate. Today we're opening what is, well, it's arguably the Bible of modern feminism. We are traveling back to the smoke-filled cafes of Paris, 1949, to discuss a book that didn't just describe women's lives, it completely re-engineered how the Western world understands the concept of woman. We're discussing Simone de Beauvoir and her magnum opus, The Second Sex.
It's a massive text, over 800 pages of history, biology, and existentialist philosophy. And while its impact is undeniable, I don't think either of us would dispute that it shifted the tectonic plates of culture. We're here to question the cost of that shift. The central question we need to wrestle with is this: does Beauvoir's framework of absolute freedom actually liberate women, or does it impose a cold, almost masculine standard of success that devalues the lived experiences of mothers, caregivers, and, well, anyone who doesn't want to live their life as a public intellectual?
I represent the position that the second sex is the indispensable toolkit for liberation. Beauvoir provided the first, rigorous philosophical argument for separating biological sex from social gender. She gave women the intellectual weaponry to stop being the other and become free subjects capable of choosing their own destiny.
And I take the position that while her diagnosis of the problem was sharp and necessary, her cure was elitist and ethically dangerous. I'll argue that Beauvoir's definition of transcendence, her ideal of freedom, explicitly demonizes domestic life and motherhood. And furthermore, I believe her philosophy of existence precedes essence, when applied to real human beings, led to a form of narcissism that justified the exploitation of vulnerable people in her own life.
Okay, so let's ground this discussion in the woman herself before we get into the density of the philosophy. Simone de Beauvoir wasn't merely Sartre's girlfriend, as the 1940s press just loved to paint her. She was an intellectual phenomenon. She passed the agrégation in philosophy at age 21, the youngest person ever to do so. For our listeners who aren't familiar with the French system, this isn't just a final exam. It is a grueling, highly competitive ranking of the best minds in the country.
Though, to be fair to the history, she did come in second. Jean-Paul Sartre came in first.
Right, but only because Sartre had failed it the year prior and was retaking it. The jury actually debated awarding it to her because she was younger, passed on her first attempt, but, ultimately they gave it to the senior student. The point is, she possessed a rigorous, systematic mind. The Second Sex is not a memoir or a complaint. It is a dismantling of a millennial-old myth. Her core thesis is that throughout history, humanity has been defined as male. Man is the absolute, man is the subject, woman is defined only in relation to him, she is the other.
Right. I don't dispute the historical accuracy of that observation when she cites Aristotle saying women are female by virtue of a certain lack of qualities, or Thomas Aquinas calling women imperfect men. The evidence is just damning. That historical survey she does is brilliant.
It is foundational. Beauvoir argued that this othering isn't natural. It's a story men tell to maintain power. By identifying femininity as a historical and social construction, she breaks the spell. She tells women your inferiority isn't written in your DNA, it's written in your laws, in your culture. And because it was made by humans, it can be unmade by humans.
I grant you the power of the diagnosis. But we have to look at the philosophical engine driving this car. Beauvoir is an existentialist. We need to be clear about what that means because existentialism is a word people throw around at parties without really defining it. She operates on the maxim that existence precedes essence.
A concept that is often quoted but rarely understood in its full weight.
So let's define it then. It means we are born as a blank slate, that's existence. We have no predefined purpose, no human nature, no God-given soul that tells us who to be. We create our essence solely through our actions and our choices.
Precisely. We are what we do. We are the sum of our actions.
But here is the tension, and it's a big one. Beauvoir argues that existence precedes essence, meaning we are radically free to define ourselves. Yet the Second Sex spends hundreds of pages arguing that women are almost entirely constructed by society, biology, and men. If we are radically free, how can we be the victims of such total social conditioning? It feels like she's trying to have it both ways. Women are victims of a trap, but they are also somehow responsible for not breaking out of it.
I think you're conflating freedom with power. Beauvoir argues that women possess the ontological freedom, the potential to define themselves, but they are in a situation where that freedom is blocked. The tragedy of the other is that she is a free subject who is forced to live as an object. She isn't saying the trap isn't real, she's saying the trap isn't natural.
I think it goes deeper than just being blocked. I think Beauvoir views the specific reality of being female, the biological reality, not just as a situation, but as a curse. She seems to view the female body as a trap that drags women back into the muck of nature, preventing them from achieving the kind of abstract intellectual freedom she valued so much.
That is a harsh reading. She's analyzing how the body is used against women, not attacking the body itself.
Is it? Let's look at the text. She describes the female body with words that, they evoke horror. She talks about the tyranny of reproduction. She calls the fetus a parasite that feeds on the woman's resources. She describes the pregnant body as life passive and uncontrolled. This isn't just analysis, this is revulsion.
But it's revulsion at the loss of autonomy. You have to remember, she's writing in 1949. No pill, no legal abortion. Pregnancy often was a tyranny for women who had no choice in the matter.
Fair point on the context, but it feels like she is trying to solve the problem of women's oppression by suggesting women should become more like men. Detached, autonomous, project-oriented. She doesn't seem to want to validate a female experience. She wants to transcend it. She wants women to escape their bodies to become minds.
Because historically, validating that experience was the trap. Oh, you're so good at nurturing, you stay in the kitchen while I go run the government. Beauvoir saw that glorifying the mystery of motherhood was just a consolation prize given to women to keep them docile. And this leads us directly to the most famous concept in the book, the one that launched 1,000 gender studies departments.
One is not born, but becomes a woman. It is the bedrock of the entire modern debate.
And for good reason. Before Beauvoir, woman was seen as a static, biological destiny. Anatomy was destiny. If you had a womb, your purpose was to be a mother. Beauvoir shattered that. She distinguished between female, the biological facts, and woman, the social construct of femininity, the makeup, the passivity, the domestic role.
This distinction, sex versus gender, is something we take for granted in 2026. But in 1949, it was absolute heresy.
It was revolutionary. It implies that femininity is a learned performance. This anticipates thinkers like Judith Butler by 40 years. Butler, who cites Beauvoir extensively, argues that gender is a stylized repetition of acts. It's something we do, not something we are, Beauvoir is saying. You don't have to accept the script society handed you just because of your biology. That is the essence of liberation.
I understand the utility of that argument for liberation. It's a powerful tool. But there's a risk in taking it too far. If woman is entirely a social construct, something we just become, where is the ground to stand on? It seems to erase the material reality of the female experience. And this brings me to my major critique, her ethical system, the battle between transcendence and immanence.
Right. These are the key terms. We need to unpack them carefully because she uses them in a very specific existentialist way.
Please, go ahead.
Transcendence is the gold standard for an existentialist. It's the act of reaching out into the future. It is action, creativity, building, engineering, writing. It is changing the world. It is the project. It is doing something that hasn't been done before.
And immanence?
Immanence is stagnation. It is repetition. It is circular. Washing dishes that will just get dirty again, cooking meals that will just be eaten, cleaning a house that will get dusty tomorrow. It is maintaining life rather than creating something new. Beauvoir argues that men have claimed transcendence for themselves, war, politics, art, and relegated women to immanence.
And this is where I get off the train. She creates a hierarchy where career is good and care is bad. She looks at the work of raising a child or maintaining a home, work that is essential for the survival of the species, work that is foundational to civilization, and she dismisses it as mere repetition. She calls it torture and a waste.
She calls it a waste because it produces nothing lasting for the individual woman. The woman puts her energy in, and at the end of the day, she has nothing to show for it but a clean floor that will be dirty again.
But that is a profoundly capitalistic, almost masculine way of looking at value. If you aren't building a skyscraper or writing a novel, you aren't doing anything. That is elitist. It invalidates the lived reality of millions of women who find profound meaning in the immanent sphere of care and connection. It's an intellectual from the left bank telling a mother in the suburbs that her life is meaningless.
But do they find meaning, or are they told to find meaning? That's Beauvoir's point. She warns us about using happiness as a metric. She writes that we shouldn't ask if women are happy in their chains, we should ask if they are free. The happiness of the housewife is often just a coping mechanism for a lack of freedom.
But she doesn't just ask the question, she wants to dictate the answer. We have to talk about her 1975 interview with Betty Friedan.
This is years after the book, so these are her mature, solidified views. This isn't just theory anymore, this is prescription.
I know the one you're referring to. It is. Uncompromising.
Friedan asked her a simple question. Should we pay women for housework? Should there be a wage for raising children? It was a popular feminist idea at the time to give economic value to domestic labor.
And Beauvoir said no. She said no because she believed it would trap women in the home forever. If you pay them to stay, they will never leave.
She went much further than that. She said, and I'm quoting, "No woman should be authorized to stay at home to raise her children."
Authorized? It's a strong word, I admit.
It's a tyrannical word. She continued, "Women should not have that choice, precisely because if there is such a choice, too many women will make that one. That is not liberation, my friend. That is authoritarianism." She is saying you are too stupid or too conditioned to know what is good for you, so I, the philosopher, will remove the option. She wanted to outlaw the choice of motherhood as a primary vocation.
You're reading it as authoritarianism. I read it as structural intervention. Beauvoir understood that choice does not exist in a vacuum. As long as the path of least resistance, the path of imminence, is available and glorified by society, women will be pressured into it. If you want equality, true equality, you have to burn the bridge behind you. You have to force women into the economy, because economic independence is the sine qua non of freedom. You cannot be a free subject if you are dependent on a man for your food.
So to save women, she has to destroy the things many women love? It implies that the only way to be a successful woman is to act like a successful man. It replaces the patriarchy with a matriarchy of the intelligentsia. It's saying your freedom only counts if it looks like my freedom.
It's not about acting like a man, it's about participating in the human enterprise. And Beauvoir lived this. She didn't just write about it, she refused to be a mother. She refused to be a wife. Which I think brings us to the third dimension of our debate. Her lived philosophy. She and Sartre were the ultimate power couple, but they rejected the bourgeois rules of ownership.
They certainly rejected the rules, but looking back, I'm not sure they replaced them with something better.
They had a soul partnership. They never married, they never lived together, they had other lovers, often many of them, but they maintained total transparency with one another. It was a radical experiment in honesty and freedom. They wanted to prove that you could love someone without possessing them.
Experiment is the right word. And like many experiments, there was collateral damage. Significant damage.
They were attempting to break the mold of the dutiful wife and the cheating husband.
But if we look at the historical record, specifically the memoirs of the women who were pulled into their orbit, Bianca Lamblin, Natalie Sorachini, the picture isn't one of noble transparency. It looks like predation.
You are referring to the trio relationships.
I am referring to the fact that Beauvoir, as a teacher in her 30s, would cultivate intense sexual and romantic relationships with her teenage female students. She would then groom them, to use the modern terminology, and pass them over to Sartre.
These were complex relationships in a time of very different sexual mores.
Let's not relativize this away. Bianca Lamblin, who was originally known as Bianca Bienfeld, she wrote that she felt she was a sexual toy for the couple. She said their letters, which were published after their deaths, revealed they laughed about her, used her, and then just discarded her. Beauvoir's philosophy was existence precedes essence. I am free to do what I want. But she seemed to forget the other half of the equation, responsibility.
I admit, the letters were a shock to the scholarly community. They revealed a coldness, a callousness toward these third parties that is hard to reconcile with her public stance on justice. It's not just hard to reconcile. It's a direct violation of her own ethics. She wrote in the Ethics of Ambiguity that no project can be defined except by its interference with other projects. Basically, my freedom ends where yours begins. Yet she treated these young women not as projects or subjects, but as objects. They were props in her and Sartre's grand narrative of freedom.
I won't defend the abuse of power dynamics. It was exploitative. Her teaching license was actually revoked in 1943 because of a complaint from Natalie Sorachini's parents. It was a serious failing. However, I have to ask, does the personal failing of the architect cause the building to collapse? Does the fact that Beauvoir was manipulative in her love life negate the structural analysis of the second sex? It makes us question the philosophy itself.
If absolute freedom leads to treating other people like disposable tissues, maybe absolute freedom is a bad goal. And it wasn't just her sex life. In 1977, Beauvoir, along with Sartre and Foucault, the giants of French intellect, signed a petition to decriminalize sex with children.
The petition regarding the age of consent, yes. That is a difficult document to look at today.
They argued that a 12 or 13-year-old child could consent and that laws protecting them were oppressive. This is the logical endpoint of a philosophy that idolizes liberty above all else. When you strip away all social norms because you view them as constructs, you lose the protective barriers that keep vulnerable people safe. She was so obsessed with freedom that she couldn't see the power imbalance.
That petition was a catastrophic error in judgment, shared by an entire generation of French libertarians who confused liberation with license. It is a stain on her record, and it shows the danger of abstracting everything. But I would argue we must separate the tool from the user. Beauvoir gave us the tool to analyze oppression. We can use that tool to analyze her oppression of others.
That is a convenient way to salvage the legacy. She gave us the weapon we use against her.
It is a necessary way. Look, without Beauvoir, we don't have second-wave feminism. Betty Friedan, Kate Millett, Shulamith Firestone, they all stood on her shoulders. Even if we reject her specific prescriptions on motherhood or her personal behavior, her core insight that women are made, not born, is the oxygen that modern sociology breathes. If we throw that out, we are back to biological essentialism. We are back to women are naturally submissive.
I agree that the second sex is historically vital. You cannot tell the story of the 20th century without it, but I maintain it is a cautionary tale. It shows what happens when you prioritize abstract concepts over human beings. She offered a brilliant diagnosis. Women were second-class citizens. But her cure was to demand women become super beings, stripped of their biological ties, stripped of the immanence of home, operating in a cold, competitive world of projects.
And I would argue that what you call coldness was a necessary hardness. To break a chain that had held for 5,000 years, she couldn't be soft. She had to be absolute. She had to demand that women step into the frightening light of responsibility. She knew it would be hard. She knew it would be alienating. But she believed it was the only way to be fully human.
Perhaps. But in doing so, she created a new set of expectations that weigh heavily on women today. The pressure to have it all, to be the intellectual, the worker, the creator. And the shame women feel when they just want to be mothers, or when they find joy in the imminent. That shame is Beauvoir's ghost haunting us.
And yet, because of her, that shame is a choice, not a destiny. The door is open. Whether you walk through it and what you carry with you, a briefcase, a diaper bag, or both, is now up to you.
A complex freedom, indeed, and one that we are still figuring out how to inhabit safely.
That is the challenge she left us. To take the freedom she fought for and perhaps build a more ethical world with it than she managed to do herself.
I can agree with that.
Thank you for listening to The Debate.